So when I started talking about Faust and science and technology and magic, I definitely did not think I was going to end up doing an episode about IVF and designer babies. But here we go. We're doing it live. One of the questions I get a lot about this show is how much I prepare. Like, am I just talking like off the cuff, off the top of my head, or am I writing stuff out, or what? And I don't write scripts out. I haven't done that since the very beginning, really, of the show. But I do prepare a lot. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of reading that goes into the show, and I make sure I have all the passages ready that I want to talk about, and the dates of things, and all that kind of written down in my notes. But part of the magic, not just of doing this show, but of reading great literature more generally, is that one of the things that makes a book truly great, truly enduring, is that when you open it, no matter how many times you've read it, no matter how familiar you think you are with the historical context, no matter what else you know about the period and the work and all of that, you never know what it's going to say to you, what it's going to reveal to you. That's why great literature, truly great literature, is an adventure. It's because by looking so deeply into the heart of some one human experience, a great artist can actually capture more than he understands. That's why Plato was onto something when he suggested that great singers like Ion are really conduits of something else, of a divine insight or a divine knowledge, if they're anything at all. I mean, Plato was obviously very skeptical of art and wary of its powers, but not because he didn't take it seriously. It's because he thought most people didn't take it seriously enough, and that art at its best, but also at its most potent, is like this opening for pure divine light to shine through. And divine light, divine wisdom, divine knowledge is not like human knowledge. We know things in this specific propositional way because we're bounded in time. And so we have to make these either or statements and think in propositional logic. But when we do that, what we're really doing is unfolding a unitary, pure, divine wisdom. And sometimes when an artist is really inspired, that is breathed into by God and by heaven, then you get this little vial, this little container full of divine light, and out of that can unfold insight after insight. And this explains, for example, the nature of the Bible, the nature of Scripture, why you can go back to Genesis in 2024, in the age of quantum physics and space travel, and go back to this thousands of years old text and find that it's speaking directly to this moment, is because it's not just a series of rules or a list of items or a propositional set of rational arguments. It's actually a container. It's a vessel for divine light. And Scripture is prime in that regard, but all art that is truly great does this in some respects. And so when people ask, do you prepare? I say, I prepare, but I can never really be prepared. In other words, I do research and I get ready, but then sometimes even in mid-flow, as I'm talking about something and thinking through this stuff with you, but certainly anytime I go back to the text, there's new stuff, and there's stuff that it seems to be speaking right now into this moment. And one example of this is that as I was starting to think about how to finish this series, which we've been doing for a while now, about how magic kind of represents the dangers and the promise and the possibilities of science, and how we are living through this very magical moment in all of the ways that, all of the good and bad ways that that implies, I was thinking, how am I going to land this plane? How am I going to bring this thing home? Because I think we are about to finish our time for now with Goethe's Faust, and that in turn has been the culmination of many weeks of talking about Marlowe's Faust and Merlin and magic and so on and so forth. And we're going to bring this to a close now and talk about some other topics. But I was thinking, how am I going to bring this thing to a close? And I was looking through Faust Part II, which is really the trippy one. I mean, both of them are very high romantic German, crazy allegorical, but part two is where things start to get truly mind-bending. And it's a series, as I said before, kind of vignettes or little isolated stories that then fold together into the grand story of how Faust, the man of longing and knowledge, is tempted but ultimately saved. How he and in him the quest for human knowledge, the fate of scientific man, how all of that is redeemed. And that's what Goethe sets up at the very beginning with the council in heaven, where God says, this scientific revolution thing is like a bud that the tree is putting forth. And I know that it's still confused and dangerous, but it's going to blossom into a new stage in the life of man. And that's his bet with Mephistopheles. And so the whole story is about how to redeem the thing that we are now fighting through, which is the scientific age and the hyper-scientistic age and all the dangers of that. And in the process of thinking through this, I came across this episode that I think is going to get us to the heart of it and really kind of help us think through some of this stuff. And it has to do not with Faust, but with another character named Wagner. Not the musician Wagner, but Wagner, Faust's assistant. And this is a really interesting foil character. Faust always has in canonical versions of the story a kind of underling. And he treats him, in this version at least, with a lot of scorn because he finds him too pedestrian. He's sort of like the actor for the masses. And I would picture casting this guy as a sort of character actor that's able to play broadly to the crowd. Because Mephistopheles and Faust have this sort of elitism about them. And Mephistopheles wants esoteric knowledge. He wants the knowledge that the vulgar masses can't really understand, that they need to be, shepherded and controlled, but not let in on the true wisdom. But Wagner is like an Enlightenment kind of shill. He's like your average Enlightenment enjoyer. He really believes in this stuff and in the power of reason and science to better man's lot. And part of the comedy of the play is showing how that high, noble aspiration turns into this kind of bumbling, disastrous hellscape through the ministrations of Mephistopheles. And it reminds me a lot, actually, of another relationship that we've talked about on the show. The relationship between Faust and Wagner reminds me of the relationship between Ivan in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov and Rakitin. So if Ivan is the Faust here, he's the one who sees so deeply that he's tormented by it. And he has peered all the way into the void, and he comes back with this kind of wide-eyed horror and fear, but also a kind of manic excitement. Rakitin is just midwit enough to do really well in the intellectual world. He's not one of the plebs, one of the crowd, but he's also not so full of insight that it breaks him the way it kind of breaks Ivan. And so he becomes a famous and successful socialist writer because he thinks, we're going to get rid of God. We won't need morality, or rather, we won't need God for morality, and we're just going to have progress and socialism, and won't it all be great? And Ivan is saying, no, don't you understand? When you get rid of God, evil will become your morality, and everything will be permissible. And Rakitin is saying, oh, you silly Ivan, you fool, you just don't understand the real enlightenment of my set in St. Petersburg. And he moves on to become basically everything that Dostoevsky knew as a youth and everything that he ended up rejecting and despising. And Wagner is a little bit like that. He represents the confident but ill-informed enthusiasm and optimism of a kind of midwit level bureaucratic technocrat. I'm thinking here of sort of the Barack Obama, Mark Zuckerberg type who's like, isn't it going to be great? We're going to have managerial technocracy and we'll move into this like perfect system where we won't need democracy anymore. We'll just have, models and we'll fix climate change. And we can, hope and change. And it all is kind of rolling into this terrible catastrophe. That's Wagner and that's Rakitin, right? That's the character that he sort of represents. And I want to talk about Wagner because Wagner is the main character in one of, I think, the most chilling and insightful scenes for us in Faust. This is one of those ones that just kind of leapt off the page at me this time around. And it's a scene in which Wagner creates a little tiny human being in a test tube. And I say a little tiny human being because that's what it is. It's not a baby, it's a homunculus. And that's a Latin word, a diminutive, meaning little man, basically. And I just want to read one exchange that Wagner has with Mephistopheles in which he explains what's going on here, what he's up to. And Wagner whispers, "A man is being made." Mephistopheles says, "Man? And what loving couple have you got hidden up the chimney?" So Mephistopheles, playing dumb a little bit, says here, so you've got like a man and wife or a man and a woman like having sex upstairs, and that's how you're making a person? And Wagner says, "God forbid. How unfashionable. We're free of all that idle foolery. The tender moment from which life emerged, the charming power with its inner urge took and gave, and clearly stamped its seal, first in a near and then a further field. We now divest of all that dignity." I love that. How unfashionable. How perfect is that for all that we're living through now, right? That it was nice for a while that we had natural unions that produced sex and then babies, and wasn't that great? But we've kind of moved beyond that. That's all a bit, outre. And now we've taken away that power from nature, and we've taken it into our own hands. We now divest of all that dignity. Though the creatures still enjoy it, we as men, with all our greater gifts, begin to have, as we should, a nobler origin. So he says that's for animals. And animals produced mankind. This is an evolutionary view of man. But the highest thing in man is not his body, it's his reason. And reason really was the point of all this nature stuff. But now we can just get rid of the nature and we just have the reason, isolated, separate, distinct. And this is an argument that you will find made in many post-humanist texts. And I've even found one, Nick Bostrom, who's one of the famous post-humanists, wrote a paper called Why I Want to Be a Post-Human When I Grow Up, I think is the title. And he talks about Aristotle's idea that man is the rational animal. And he says, well, if that's true, then our reason is what sets us apart, then it would follow that our reason is the best thing about us. And so why not just develop our reason to the highest possible extent? And the answer, of course, is that if man is the rational animal, that doesn't mean that reason defines man. It means that reason is the final, what would be called the idion, the unique thing that caps off or finishes, completes man. But that if you get rid of all the other stuff underneath, you don't have a human being, you have something else. But Wagner doesn't see that. He only sees the final end of man and not everything that led up to that. It's sort of the difference between saying, well, I did my job and now I got my money, the money here being reason, and so I don't need to do my job anymore, versus, oh, the work in itself is its own reward, that everything, the culmination can't really stand or exist without the process, without the birth and the growing and all of that. And Wagner wants to get rid of the process and just get the end result, which is reason. And we as men, with all our greater gifts, begin to have, as we should, a nobler origin. He turns toward the furnace. See, now there's a real chance that if, from the hundredfold substance, by mixing, since mixing makes it happen, the stuff of human life's compounded and distilled in a flask, well-founded, and in proper combination grounded, then the silent work is done. So we're going to get rid of sex, and we're going to make babies, or we're going to make new humans, rather, out of just what is purest in mankind. Now, why does this emerge at the same time as all the posthumanism? Because, as I've been talking about for weeks and weeks, if it is the case that evolution just accidentally happened to produce this thing called reason, then all the other stuff that is sort of on the way to that was just an accident. And reason really is how we get at the truth of things, and reason understood in a purely mathematical Laplacian sense. So now we don't need to be encumbered by all of these merely human things like love and aspiration and even, let's say, qualitative consciousness, qualitative experience. We can just work our way up now to pure calculation. And what's so brilliant about this, among other things, is that what Wagner actually produces is not a human being, but a miniature human being, a stunted, small individual. And this is because man, as the pure product of man, without God's intervention via nature, can only ever be smaller than what it created it. Because, of course, the creator can't make something bigger than himself. He can only make something smaller. And God, who is infinitely large, can make grand creatures. But man, who is limited, can only make a creature that is limited beneath him, underneath his own sphere. And this prefigures, by about 100 years, an insight that C.S. Lewis would develop in, I think, his greatest work of nonfiction, The Abolition of Man. This is a series of lectures, 1943, so right almost exactly 100, a little over 100 years after the second part of Faust was published. And Lewis's insight was this: we're always talking about man's power over nature. We're saying, with our technology, with our magic, with these new modes of understanding that we have, we can control the material world, control the world outside of us. But Lewis points out that actually what we're doing when we say that is we're gaining power over our fellow man, because we are a part of nature, and power is always, by its nature, vested in certain people who can use it and not in others. If we gain power over nature, then what we're saying is some people have the money, have the resources, have the insight, have the will, have the time to exert power over the physical world, and other people will have to experience that power, because power can't really exist unless there's somebody in control and somebody outside of control. And this includes, importantly, the power of previous generations to mold and shape and create, as Wagner is doing, future generations. And Lewis's point, which is also the point of the homunculus, is that future generations, by that very fact, become smaller and more weak than the ones before them. Even as the ones before them are saying, yes, we're going to create a master race. We're going to create perfect genetically engineered babies that have all of our favorite characteristics. Well, it's us, the ones who are doing that get to pick which characteristics are our favorite. And so then we are creating a master race that is in essentially our image and getting to tell people more and more exactly how they're going to be before they're even born. So here's Abolition of Man, 1943. Lewis says, "Those who write on social matters have not yet learned to imitate the physicists by always including time among the dimensions. In order to understand fully what man's power over nature, and therefore the power of some men over other men, really means, we must picture the race extended in time from the date of its emergence to that of its extinction. Each generation exercises power over its successors." This is something that's always true. Burke talks about how society is a compact between the living, the dead, and those yet unborn. And tradition is one of the ways that we exert power over future generations, right? Each, insofar as it modifies the environment bequeathed to it and rebels against tradition, resists and limits the power of its predecessors. So the young also have the ability, in the natural state of things, natural course of things, to resist the power of their parents. And often, of course, this is what the young do. They will resist whatever is imposed upon them as a way of exerting their own individuality and their own will, right? This modifies the picture which is sometimes painted of a progressive emancipation from tradition and a progressive control of natural processes, resulting in a continual increase of human power. So he's saying we usually think that as we get technology, we get more, our future generations get more and more power to break free of the past. But actually, it's technology that enables past generations to impose their will on the future. In reality, says Lewis, of course, if any one age really attains, by eugenics and scientific education, the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are the patients of that power. They are weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. And if, as is almost certain, the age which had thus attained maximum power over posterity were also the age most emancipated from tradition, it would be engaged in reducing the power of its predecessors almost as drastically as that of its successors. And we must also remember that, quite apart from this, the later a generation comes, the nearer it lives to the date at which the species becomes extinct, the less power it will have in the forward direction, because its subjects will be so few. There is therefore no question of a power vested in the race as a whole steadily growing as long as the race survives. The last men, far from being heirs of power, will be of all men most subject to the dead hand of the great planners and conditioners, and will themselves exercise least power upon the future. And this is that cautionary note that Lewis is striking throughout the whole book, the whole series of lectures, and that I think should pull us up short when we start to get excited, as many people are, about the possibility of genetic engineering, of embryonic selection, of all the sorts of technologies that would enable us, and I say this truly, that would enable us to do great things, like eliminate diseases. Of course, nobody wants children to be born with terrible diseases and deformities, and that is part of the impulse that leads us to look into things like embryonic genetics. Now, I'm going to get into talking about that more directly in a second, but I just want to first introduce these principles of caution that come from Wagner and from Lewis so that we understand what we're getting ourselves into, what kind of magical forces we're toying with. The whole reason that I like talking about things from this perspective is it gets us out of the usual two reactions, which are total techno-optimism, like, yeah, anything we can do is great, we have more power, right? But also, it gets us out of total techno-pessimism that would just react negatively against everything. I think there's also an impulse, and I feel this impulse more powerfully because of my conservative leanings generally. There's also an impulse to just look at any new thing and immediately see how disaster can ensue. But since these things are going to start coming into our lives, we're going to develop the capacity to do these things at least. We need to think, I think, more seriously than just reactively about what versions of this look like life and what versions actually look like death. And Lewis is saying there is a version of this, which might be the most popular or powerful version in the public imagination, which seems like life but is actually death. And that's the idea of total control. If we could just get nature out of the picture altogether, then we would have power. And really what we would be doing is reducing future generations to something smaller than human, to something, to homunculi, to little Wagnerian mini-men, right? And there's an important aspect of this, which is that when you get nature out of the picture, you remove a lot of randomness, you remove a lot of pain, and you remove a lot of suffering. But if you get nature out of the picture entirely, you also remove joy and pleasure and delight, because the source of all of our natural feeling for things is actually our bodies. It's not merely physical when we feel pleasure or experience joy, but it does come to us through our bodies. And so if we get rid of the body, or if we gain total control over the body and standardize it, many people are saying, as they say online, that what will happen then is not that you'll get a perfect utopia, but that you'll be sort of dead inside, essentially. And this is something that Lewis brings out in his greatest fictional work, which is called That Hideous Strength. There's a character in That Hideous Strength who really represents, I think, the core of what Lewis is trying to say about technology and posthumanism, and his name is Filostrato. He's an Italian, and he has this whole thing that I've mentioned before about the just end of organic life. And Filostrato does this stuff that is right out of the modern day. Like, he wants to cut down natural trees and make artificial trees because they're so much more clean and precise, and they're not random like the way normal trees grow in the world. I don't know if you saw, but recently there was a city that put up these like blocks of algae that was just clear green plexiglass, or rather plexiglass green slats with algae inside that were designed to do the same thing as trees, that is, produce oxygen, but they're more easily controlled. And that's what Philostrato represents. And he says at one point that what he's going to do in the end is get rid of natural procreation. He says, it is simple, my friends. In us, organic life has produced mind. It has done its work. After that, we want no more of it. We would not want the world. We do not want the world any longer furred over with organic life, like what you call the blue mold, all sprouting and budding and breeding and decaying. We must get rid of it. By little and little, of course. Slowly we learn how. Learn how to make our brains live with less and less body. Learn to build our bodies directly with chemicals. No longer have to stuff them full of dead brutes and weeds. Learn how to reproduce ourselves without copulation. I don't think that would be much fun, said Winter. My friends, you have already separated the fun, as you call it, from the fertility. The fun itself begins to pass away. Bah! I know that is not what you think. But look at your English women. 6 out of 10 are frigid, are they not? You see, nature herself begins to throw away the anachronism. What Lewis is doing here is something that George Orwell also sees in 1984, which is a perhaps more famous book than That Hideous Strength, and comes out just a few years after That Hideous Strength. 1949 is when Orwell publishes 1984, which is, of course, his dystopian novel about the Soviet Union and about the kind of wild excesses of rationalism and central planning and so on and so forth. And this book, if you have not read 1984, it's suffered from overuse. It's been a victim of its own success. And there are some books like this that are so exhaustively quoted, constantly quoted, and used kind of in a slogan-y, bumper stickery way that we start to get bored of them before we've even really paid any attention to them. I am here to tell you that 1984 is every bit as good as its reputation. And if you haven't read it, it's a great sci-fi read. You should check it out. So I'm not going to tell you even who is making this speech, because that's one of the reveals in the book. But there is a speech by a party leader, and something that we don't always remember, about how the party leaders are intending to abolish the orgasm. And that's because order and power has become the law of their activity. And what began in the bright optimism of a human utopia on Earth has now turned into this diabolical power first, power only mentality. And here's what the speaker, the representative of the party says. The old civilizations claimed that they were founded on love or justice. Ours is founded upon hatred. In our world, there will be no emotions except fear, rage, triumph, and self-abasement. Everything else we shall destroy. Everything. Already we are breaking down the habits of thought which have survived from before the revolution. We have cut the links between child and parent, and between man, and between man and woman. No one dares trust a wife or a child or a friend any longer. We might think here of the Soviet denunciations or the denunciations under Mao Zedong. This was a feature of communist regimes. But in the future, there will be no wives and no friends. Children will be taken from their mothers at birth as one takes eggs from a hen. The sex instinct will be eradicated. Procreation will be an annual formality like the renewal of a ration card. We shall abolish the orgasm. Our neurologists are at work upon it now. So in Wagner and in Faust, Goethe was hitting on something that 100 years later, Orwell and Lewis and some of these other guys were able to see more clearly because it had advanced further. But the idea, the germ of the idea was already there in everything Goethe was most concerned about, which was the anti-human view of life, or the view of man as a purely rational instrument. That is, as something that happened to come by accident out of the dirt, out of the apes and the mud, but was only ever really meant to be a thinking mind. And reason itself, the worship of reason isolated from the physical world, was what Goethe saw in the satanic side of magic and of technological power and all of these other things. Lewis takes this forward. Orwell takes this forward. We are right on the doorstep of all these issues now, because it's starting to become materially possible to exert a great deal of control over the future and to separate not just sex from procreation, but procreation from the natural overflow of life that it has represented for the entire history of the human species. And so we're forced up against this problem, this question, which is, do our bodies and our connection to nature and to all the so-called lower life forms and our place on the continuum of life, does that have anything to say about us, or is it merely an inconvenience? Because we know it is an inconvenience. It limits us. It saddles us with all sorts of diseases and terrible things. And everything that I'm about to say, and all that I'm about to say, I don't mean to minimize that one whit, one iota. And I also feel a certain degree of caution here, because I'm about to talk about something that in my circles online generated just the classic kind of dunking on Twitter reaction, which is that a company called Orchid, that nobody had ever heard about until about 5 minutes ago, and their CEO, Noor Siddiqui, announced that they had produced the first IVF baby who was completely genetically screened. And as usual on Twitter, it wasn't immediately clear that everybody understood exactly what was going on. I think this was filed under a bunch of other man-made horrors beyond our comprehension, such as artificial wombs and those sorts of, abortion, of course, on demand. IVF has been closely yoked to that issue in the news. And so it wasn't immediately clear exactly what was going on here. But what this is a technology that people use right now as part of IVF, as part of in vitro fertilization, to screen their embryos genetically at a much, much higher rate than previously they've been able to. I think it's something like 99% of the genome can be screened rather than 1% in other methods. And this video was about the fact that a baby has just been born who was chosen purposefully selected among various frozen eggs, various embryos, to be implanted. And I feel some caution here, because the IVF issue has gotten yoked together into the abortion issue. It's often been associated primarily with gay people having children, which I think if you pull the camera back, there's sort of more going on here than that. I personally would never do this, and I have moral objections to certainly IVF that creates multiple embryos, but I would never do this in my own life. And so I'm also wary, though, that at a larger kind of camera angle, when you pull this back, this isn't simply the sort of thing that you can just dunk on Twitter and call it a day. I have relatives who were produced through IVF. I have friends who have done it in a kind of one egg at a time sort of way, so they weren't killing anybody. We're up against this terrible crisis in birth rates, and this is one way that many people who can't have children are enabled to have children. And besides that, if, in fact, you were able somehow to, let's say, cure a genetic defect in the womb, if you were able to stop a baby from growing up with spina bifida or whatever, to intervene gently in the process of natural birth or even of, single egg IVF, it would be wrong to simply react against that, to stop that from happening, I think, because that, nobody wants children to be born into the world stunted or in pain. And there are uses, of course, of this technology, and those are the ones that are primarily put up front, that you can imagine having real benefits and being of real value. But what we're not saying when we talk about all of that is the enormous and, I think, totally unanswered set of moral questions that then come to the fore. And this, I think, was in the news a little bit when the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that embryos are people in the same way that fetuses are people, and therefore protected under the law. And so this lab tech that dropped, I think it was a vial of embryos, was liable it was a criminal act. And that just raised the issue that even when we're doing this in ways that, are admirable for other reasons, like when people who can't have kids are being enabled to have kids by IVF, there's kind of this wild west of moral concerns that amount to treating people and embryos like our objects or our playthings for toying with, in this exact way that Wagner and Lewis and Orwell are all talking about. And when I watched the whole video of this orchid baby, and it was this combination of, wow, I can think of all the ways you could use this well, with a kind of quiet horror, because the mother in the video is showing a big picture of the embryo that she ended up having to her child and saying, hey, that was you, bud. This is a picture of you. And the unspoken thing is, well, okay, but what about all those other embryos? If that embryo was already your baby, then what about all these other embryos that you're creating and selecting among? And so I don't have any answers here, and I'm not in a position to pronounce doom and judgment upon anybody for anything, really. But I do think that we have a responsibility to reason seriously and morally about the weightiest of all questions, and not simply out of a reactionary horror, but because we have this power in our hands, this magical technological power that gives us incredible control over children, over our young future generations. And the power now exists. It has come into being. That technology is there. And so the question is not, are we going to destroy it? I don't even know what that means. It's knowledge. You really can't unmake it. But you can ask and take seriously the question, how should we wield it? And in that, I think the Philostrato and the Lewis and the Goethe of it all is actually a helpful guide. It shows us where the danger is. The danger is in becoming lords over future generations and turning them into our little playthings to dispatch with, to dispose of if they are insufficiently genetically pure, or to alter at will rather than simply for their own good. And you can already see all of this coming down the pike, even as you can see good use cases for how this could be enable people to have babies in an ethical way and to intervene even. I mean, I believe, since I believe that a fetus is a person, that to abort a baby because you found a genetic defect is a terrible wrong. But I also think that scientists could totally figure out, and I think are working on ways to heal disorders in a baby and to see them in the womb when they are able to heal them and to intervene in that way, which would be a good thing. And so it's not as easy, for me at least, as just dunking on it on Twitter and calling that a day or just recoiling in horror, much as I feel that impulse. I feel the impulse to recoil in horror, but this closer look at things through the lens of the Western canon invites a slightly more careful approach here. And so I want to point out something weird and just puzzle through it with you and notice something. In the movie, in the video that everybody was reacting to of Orchid, Noor Siddiqui, the CEO, says a bunch of stuff about this technology that they've developed to screen embryos genetically. And one thing she says is, I think basically sex is for fun and embryo screening is for babies. And she says it with great enthusiasm, but it sounds almost exactly like those passages I just read where, okay, so you split up sex and baby making entirely. You don't just allow people to do kinds of sex that don't make babies. You also split the two things totally from one another, and you decide now that they have nothing to do with each other. And so your sex life is now governed with no reference to procreation, and your procreation is now governed with no reference to sex. And you think that what you're doing is enabling both to reach their highest potential. The babies will be the best babies, and the sex will be the best sex if you just split these two things up. Sort of in the same way that if you split up the mind and the body, then the body will be, perfectly in service to reason, and reason will be perfectly pure if we just get the two things separate and we make mankind into a purely rational being as a lord over a purely physical nature. But it might be actually that these two things work better together, and that sex is better and babies are better when there is some connection between the two of them. And so here's what's really interesting to me about this. The Catholic position, the Catholic view, is kind of the opposite extreme from what Siddiqui is saying in this video, that sex is for fun and embryo screening is for babies. And that is that sex and procreation go together. Sex is for babies, or babies are the kind of highest pinnacle, the overflow of all the goods of sex, just as reason is the highest pinnacle of all the goods of human development, even though it doesn't transcend or get beyond those other goods, and we shouldn't just leave our bodies behind, right? And traditionally, typically, we understand this as a way of controlling sex, right? We think sex is so intense, such a huge pleasure, that if you let it just run wild, it'll wreak havoc. And so the position of the church gradually over time, the Catholic position that has emerged, is you should only have sex if you are situationally and emotionally, mentally prepared to have kids, and you do it in the context of marriage. And this develops sort of throughout chivalric literature in order to bring the sex impulse under control, to bring this wild, raging stallion to heel. And sex is so fun that we need its teleological purpose to limit it. That's what I understand to have understood usually throughout history to be the point of the Catholic teaching. And I'm reading the Arthur Legends right now, the Morts d'Arthur, which is a work by Sir Thomas Malory, sort of gathering together all these Arthur myths. And there's actually a lot, there's sort of a very frank idea about sex in it, that everybody is kind of like horny all the time in these legends. But there is this ideal that you should kind of channel that into civilization building. And it's from this, I think, that we get our idea of the Catholic teaching. But now that the tides are turning in this other direction and people are actually having less sex, like I would like for there to be more horniness in the world, because it seems as if kids aren't having as much sex and there's kind of this revulsion about the body. It's turning out there's also a complementary purpose to that Catholic teaching, which is not just to keep sex connected to babies. It's also to keep having babies connected to sex. In other words, don't go around doing sex if you're not prepared to have babies, but also don't go around making babies if you're not in love with life enough and in love with each other enough to be having sex. And this has only kind of become clear in the last 100 years or so, as you've got these people who want to abolish the orgasm, right? Who want to separate these two things altogether, at which point sex sort of becomes this glum ritual, this routine, and baby making becomes this scientific process. And neither of those things is very fun, and some of those things are quite alarming and dangerous. And so it's turning out that the Catholic idea is a protection against two opposite flanks, against debauchery, but also against sexlessness. And this is why the Catholic catechism teaches that there are two functions to sex, not just that its purpose is procreative, but that it is also unitive, which means that it's there also to build this bond of love between husband and wife in the Catholic catechism. And this comes ultimately from, it's older than this, but there is a famous encyclical by Pope Paul from 1968, and Pope Francis, for all that he's kind of a lib and has been very radical, has recently kind of cited this encyclical in which Pope Paul says, the particular doctrine often expounded by the magisterium of the church is based on the inseparable connection established by God, which man on his own initiative may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent to the marriage act. And this is what leads to the prohibition, not just on abortion, but on birth control and on all of this other stuff that would separate the unitive and the procreative functions of sex. Now, I am not a Catholic, and people often ask me why, because I'm so interested in Catholic teaching, and I think that it is this font of great wisdom. And in this case, here's an example, right, where this idea, the Catholics have honed down this idea so precisely that it turns out to be actually quite durable into a totally new situation, and it has something to say in this totally new situation. So people are always saying, why aren't you a Catholic? And my reason for this is not because I disagree with certain Catholic teachings, although I do. I have actual disagreements with certain Catholic beliefs, propositions like the perpetual virginity of Mary and that sort of thing. But my real reason for this is that although I think the Catholic system might be the smartest system for trying to embody God's will in the world, I also think that the world is always bigger, and God's will is therefore always bigger than human systems can encapsulate. And so although I'm able to believe that the Catholic system is kind of genius, I'm not able to believe that it is coterminous with God's will. And so systems can be beautiful as guides. They are absolutely perfect for defining what should be the standard and the norm. I'm not willing to concede that they should be the absolute rule. And so when in this encyclical we get this kind of absolutism about the union at all times and in all places between the unitive and the procreative purposes of sex, I'm able to see exactly how that's the principle we should all be aiming at. I'm not able to see how that should be the hard and fast, inexhaustible rule because of some of the stuff I said earlier, right? About how I know people that have carefully proceeded with ethical IVF, and I have relatives that have been that exist because of this technology, and I just think that although Catholic teaching is this enormous source of wisdom, the rest of us, and I don't think I'm alone in this, the rest of us have to live in the messy middle, where there is a standard, there is a perfect, there is an ideal, but there's also the messy variety of life, which is part of nature and is why nature isn't just something we can get rid of or systematize away. And so with all of that having been said, I think that this church teaching is this font of wisdom and a center out of which other good insight can emerge. But I wanted to introduce to you the concept, the Greek idea of the basanos, or the kriterion. And basanos just means a touchstone, and a kriterion just means like a kind of focal point or a guiding star. So a touchstone is like the thing that you come back to again and again. And in all of this series of episodes, as I'm thinking about man's power over man and man's power over nature, and Goethe and Lewis and all these people, Marlowe even, I've been trying to use the Western canon as a basanos, as a touchstone, as a kind of return to this focal point that can guide us as new situations emerge, which I do think call for some stuff that we've never thought about before. And I think that the world and history is so much more various and strange and kind of hilariously varied than we want it to be. And we kind of want to shut it down into these hard and fast rules. But I think personally that rather than a set of hard and fast rules, a better concept would be the basanos, would be the touchstone. That this is the thing that we return to and then move out from with caution as we start to encounter new situations. And that's what I want to cling to here. I'm not prepared to adopt a hard and fast rule that you should only ever do sex for, if you're set up to procreate. And I'm not prepared to adopt a hard and fast rule that you should totally shut down this genetic screening technology and never touch it because it threatens the unity of sex and procreation. But I do think that when we are taking into our hands the power, not just of life and death, but of control over the future, control over nature, we should be always aware in our minds of that picture of Wagner, Faust's servant, with a stunted little man in his test tube, because that is a danger, and it would be foolish of us to deny that that is a danger, even as it would be foolish of us to deny that there are real possibilities for good to be done with genetic screening. And so, like I said, I don't have any hard and fast answers for you here. I don't have any, table to pound with my fist. I can't tell you exactly what you should do in your particular situation. But I do want to offer you this basanos, this concept, which is that the body and the soul go together. They're not actually meant to be split apart just because one is, in some sense, more rarefied or more abstracted or more pure than the other. Doesn't mean that the body has nothing to say to us. And I think our whole problem, and what Goethe in Wagner was seeing, and in Faust was seeing, is this desire to split apart, to get rid of nature, to kick it away like a ladder, as Philostratos said. And I suspect that our guiding star here should be the union of body and soul. And that is why it is brilliant that the way Goethe ends up saving Faust is through the sacred feminine. Because in the sort of symbolic language of this play, the return of woman, rescued, saved, redeemed woman into Faust is what draws him finally up out of his sinful Mephistophelian misuse of science. And I just want to read the very, very last extremely famous set of monologues at the end of this play altogether. And it's where Dr. Marianus, who is the redeemed Faust, learns through not only Gretchen, the woman that he has terribly wronged, but who has now returned and been redeemed, but also through the Virgin Mary and through the sacred feminine and all that. And Goethe, like me, by the way, was no Catholic. So this is not me or Goethe saying we should all become Catholics. But through this imagery of the sacred feminine, Goethe returned us to, and returned Faust to, this essential principle that the body and soul are united. And here's Dr. Mariana says, "Gaze toward that saving gaze, all you, the penitent and tender, to all those blissful ways. Give thanks and follow after. Let every finer sense, unseen, be offered to her service. Virgin, mother now, and queen, goddess, grant your mercies." That's not going to make the Protestants happy. I doubt it'll make the Catholics happy either. Goddess, grant your mercies. But Goethe was seeing something here. He's speaking artistically about a principle, a principle in the world and in the heavens and in nature. The mystic choir concludes, "All of the transient is parable only. The insufficient here grows to reality. The indescribable here is done. Woman, eternal, beckons us on." And it's not just woman in her role as mother, although it is that. It's woman as that which connects us to nature, even as we charge forward into this symbolically male, not literally only ever male, but symbolically male kind of driving intellectual activity that Faust represents. What he needs is to be rooted in and in fact saved by an awareness that his endeavors are always limited and circumscribed by a larger cosmic spiritual truth, and that that wisdom is the wisdom that created nature and created him. So he will never bind it within his own power or his own systems. We are going to move forward into a world with all sorts of dangers that we've never thought of. I personally am not prepared to say that those dangers mean we should shut the whole thing down from the start. I don't think that would even be possible. And I'm not saying that, we need to all kind of become Trappist monks or whatever. What I am saying is that in our motion forward into the future, It's our traditions, and even more than our traditions, it's that touchstone, that basonos of the union of body and soul that our tradition has revealed to us, that should give us pause and should make us ask, before we just create embryos willy-nilly and screen them for genetics, whether we are serving something higher than ourselves, which is represented in the divine Godhead and in the Virgin Mary, but also in the revelation of God's will, in the patterning of nature that we can see is created good, even though it causes all of these problems and even though it's obviously broken. How can we discern that patterning of nature and bring our technological endeavors in line with that slipstream, so that what we're doing is raising up and elevating and sanctifying through grace the incomplete natural world, rather than overriding and scrapping and rejecting the gifts of nature, which include sex and include joy and include babies. I think that's quite enough for one series on Faust and technology and nature. And don't fall victim to this idea that you are just a brain in a jar, because we all know that that's not right. We've been talked out of it by centuries of overconfident, hyper-Newtonian philosophizing. But at the end of the day, it's woman eternal, not just, any individual woman, but the sacred principle of the union of body and soul that beckons us on. That's it for now. Let's talk about a few orders of business. First of all, I want to tell you about the I Maked This segment, which is where I tell you about one other thing that I do besides this podcast. And this time I want to highlight actually not something that I personally wrote, but something that my father, Andrew Clavin, no relation, wrote. And that is that we run a Substack together. It's called The New Jerusalem. If you are interested in these sorts of spiritual matters, I think you will really enjoy this. It's an attempt to talk about these issues in a way that is neither sort of fearful or anti-human, but is forward-looking and is spiritually, traditionally based, is grounded in our tradition and informed by our tradition, but not limited or restrained by it. And my dad has been facing, as some of you may know, a lot of anti-Semitism in the world, which is on the rise, on the right and on the left. We're seeing it on campuses in Columbia University right now. You will also find it if you talk in defense of Jewish people online. You will probably get some extremely ugly things said in your mentions. I know I have, and my dad certainly has. And so he wrote an essay reflecting on this in the most serious possible way from the point of view of his own conversion from Judaism to Christianity. And it's called Anti-Semitism is the Devil's Flagpole. It's about the history of Christendom and its close relationship with Judaism that has created not only a kind of spiritual brotherhood between Jews and Christians, but also a tortured psychological resentment in some Christians throughout history that leads to hideous and indeed evil acts of violence and condemnation against Jewish people. And so Anti-Semitism, the Devil's Flagpole, I'll link to it in the notes, the description of this episode. Go take a look, because I think it's well worth your time. And it's good to read something on this subject that isn't hysterical, but that is morally serious, and that takes both the Christian faith and the danger of anti-Semitism very seriously. And I think that's what my dad does there. And I have written some responses, and we will be continuing our exchange back and forth as we go in the days to come at thenewjerusalem.substack.com. Okay, let's do the mailbag. Let's talk about a question from a listener. This is, I get mailbag questions through Substack. I have my own personal Substack called rejoiceevermore.substack.com, and I so appreciate all the emails and the direct messages that I get from my subscribers. If I can't respond individually to each of you, please know that I am reading them and thinking about them and want to answer as many of them as I can. I got one that really struck me, and I just thought this was a great one to highlight during our difficult political moment where academia especially seems to be going bonkers as we see the fruits of bad teaching happening in our Ivy League universities and these riots on campus. I got a question from a teacher, JC, who writes, I am an 8th grade ELA, and that stands for English and Language Arts teacher, and I recently returned from a conference for the National Council of Teachers of English. While I was under no false assumptions about that organization or the majority of its members, I was perplexed nonetheless. The sessions available to me were things like queering the classroom, how to introduce CRT into your classroom, exploring literature through an anti-oppressive lens in early childhood, and I was surrounded by posters that advocated for protesting at the conference, and one that asked and answered, why must educators love fat? Well, fat's just, delicious. Why? Surely we all should love fat. I entered this field because I believe in it. Yeah, I feel you here, brother. I believe in the works of great thinkers. I believe in the skills we develop to help us think and speak and inspire, but I don't believe in this. I teach at a small, semi-rural school district in Idaho, so this is really not an issue, but are my efforts in this one tiny little community where most of my kids are only concerned with, is it going to be fun, enough to counter the hordes of those in my profession who wield their position against the very things we should be imparting to our students? What has happened to the arts, and can my small contribution really help to win them back? Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who will guard the guards themselves? Yes. Well, my friend, thank you for this question. I really feel it when you say, I entered this field because I believe in it. Sometimes I think that, what right do I have to be talking about the Ivy League craziness or the evils of these bananas, post-pomo ideas, when I myself am kind of a swamp creature, product of the universities. But then I think, actually, no, it's because I take scholarship so seriously. In fact, because I almost revere it as a sacred profession to communicate the wisdom of the past and to try to learn from it in the present and to pass on, as the saying goes, not just ashes, but a living flame. It's because I believe in that so much that it hurts me to see these bozos taking that profession over and corrupting it in order to hoodwink fools and to abuse young people, which is what this is. It's abuse. And it is a terrible crime. It's something that gives scholarship itself a bad name, and that takes something we love and twists it into something perverse and intellectually worthless. So the question is, what difference can I make, a teacher at a small Idaho school? And the first thing I want to say is all the world of difference. And the reason is precisely because of what we've been talking about this whole time, which is the indispensable cosmic significance of every human soul. There's a famous old story about a boy throwing starfish into the sea, that the tide had washed up all these starfish who were dying outside of their oceanic environment, and the whole shore was littered with them. And this guy went along, this little boy goes along throwing the starfish back into the sea, and one of his schoolyard friends came up and said to him, why are you doing that? You can't possibly throw back enough of them for it to matter. It'll only be this tiny drop in the ocean. And it'll never matter. And the boy picked up another starfish and threw it back into the ocean and said, it mattered to that one. And that's what I think of every time I talk to you guys, right? I mean, this show has been so wonderfully successful beyond my wildest dreams, but it's not the biggest show in the world. And a show about Homer and Goethe and all this kind of egghead stuff is never going to be the most famous show in the world. But every time one of you writes in and says, because of you, I thought about going back to church, or because of you, I picked up Homer for the first time. Every time that happens, to me, it's worth an infinity. If there were only one of you out there, I would be doing this show for you, or something like it for you. Because the truth is that each person, each human soul is a world unto itself. And we may find yet in the grand course of history that those who are with us are greater than those who are against us. So even if all you're doing is teaching at this small school and holding that little territory, that is infinitely important, matters immensely to every child that passes through your doors. But then there is this bigger question about, what do? You don't want to bury your head in the sand. You don't want to ignore the structural problems, the political problems. So I would counsel you, as I often counsel myself, to think seriously and in prayer to ask, what's your assignment? Because we feel despair when we start to think about these problems and ask how we can solve the problems of the world, which the internet encourages us to do. It presents us with these enormous, massive issues, and then makes us feel like we're just this lone voice that's supposed to solve the problem or write the law or whatever. And if we don't, we're a traitor and we're falling down, whatever. You have one human's worth, one soul's worth of a job. And some people, Christopher Rufo, for example, their job is strategic political action. And some people, my job, for example, is content creation, is to speak into people's hearts and souls and to build up stuff that we can't really talk about at a political level because everything is always at a fever pitch. And that's why I was saying that, a lot of us have to live in this messy middle. And part of the benefit of great literature is it enables us to think through those things. And it might be that you have ways in your community that you can reach out just a little bit beyond the walls of your classroom to talk about stuff that's going on at a school board. Do you feel like you could make a difference to this the larger organization if you spoke out and if you it's quite possible in my mind that you could perhaps seek a leadership position and go the difficult route of trying to influence that. But maybe that's not where your gifts are served best. And maybe that's somebody else's assignment. Maybe what you are is a truly gifted educator. And what you need is to find a place where you can build that gift into the largest possible influence upon as many people as come into your ken. I don't know. I can't answer that question for you, but I can tell you that if you do your assignment, you will be doing what is well-pleasing to God. And that's the truth, because your assignment is the same thing as you. The shape of you, the nature of you, your gifts, your talents, that is the same thing as your assignment. And so asking yourself seriously how you can pour out every moment of your life in rest, in joy, and in work and in labor toward the purpose for which you were made, whether that is education or whether there is a political dimension to that or what. That's your job. That's what you should focus on, and it will matter. I absolutely promise you. It will matter cosmically, eternally, but it will also matter in ways that you don't even know and understand until a student comes back to you 20 years later and said, "You taught me to love Shakespeare." And then I went and ran for city council. And then the guy that, was on city council with me, he had his mind changed. And then we went to the state level. I mean, you see how this works, right? You are not alone, and you're not supposed to fix the world on its own. The world doesn't need you to save it. The world's already been saved. That position has been occupied. The question is, how do you participate in the forward march of that salvation and in the blessing of the world? So I hope that helps. I hope that other people too who might be struggling with these issues will take that to heart. And as for me, it's been one of the particular joys of this podcast to explore the issues of science and Faust and magic with you. We're going to turn now to some new topics. If there's anything you'd particularly like to hear about, go ahead and reach out to me. Always send me your questions at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Don't forget to subscribe, 5 stars, all that good stuff. And I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.